Hey everybody! Today's video is all about the idea of using custom hooks in React. Now in past videos I've talked about some of the hooks we're given in React, like useState and useEffect. So given that we already have these hooks which allow us to work with state and to work with lifecycle methods in regular functional components, why would creating our own custom hooks be of value? Well, if we take a look in the React docs themselves, React says, building your own hooks lets you extract component logic into reusable functions. So the idea here of reusable functions is key, because this is going to help us to avoid a lot of code duplication, and in turn create more readability in our code. We're going to see how creating a custom hook can allow us to share stateful logic between components. So let's get into an example here. So here I am in this app.js file, and as you can see I've imported React from React, and we have a basic stateless functional component, function app. And what I want to do in this app component is I want to create a piece of state which is going to be a Boolean value. And what I want to do is I want to use that piece of state to show and hide some text on the screen. So since we're working with a functional component and we know we want to use some state, let's go ahead and bring in the useState hook. And then let's get some text up on the screen. Let's create a basic H1, and we'll just say, here I am. So if we take a look in the browser, we see here I am.
Yes!
Now let's set up our piece of state, which we're going to use to determine whether or not this H1 is actually displayed or not. So we're going to call useState, and we're going to pass a Boolean value in. We're going to start it off as true, and then we'll use array destructuring. And we'll create isVisible and toggle isVisible. So since isVisible is defaulting to true, we can come in here and wrap this in curly braces. We can say isVisible and H1 here I am. And because this is true, here I am should appear on the screen. Let's go ahead and check it. There we go. If we were to flip this to false, it should no longer be visible on the screen, and it disappears. So now what we want to do is we actually want to create a button which is going to toggle that isVisible state from false to true and true to false. So let's come in here, create a button. We'll label it as show/hide. And we're going to use onClick. And in here we're going to write an arrow function, which is going to call toggle isVisible. And what we're going to do in toggle isVisible is we're going to flip that isVisible property to be the opposite of itself. So essentially we're going to toggle between visible and not visible. So let's go back to the browser. And remember we defaulted isVisible to false, so that's why we're not seeing it. When we click on this button, we see it because we're flipping from false to true, and now we flip back to false, and so on. So that was simple enough. But now let's say that we wanted to create another H1, and we also wanted to control the visibility of that H1. So we could come in here, make another H1, and this one will give some text content. We'll say, I'm here, too. And in order to toggle the visibility of this H1, what if we were to just use the same isVisible and the same toggle isVisible as we did with the first H1? So let's go ahead and try that. Let's wrap this in curly braces. We'll say isVisible and H1, I'm here too. So if this is true, this will be visible. And we'll make another button. We'll say show hide as well. And we'll just go ahead and copy this onClick and paste it here on the second button. And let's not forget this curly brace here. So now let's flip back to the browser. So now we can see that we have two buttons, each one saying show hide. One for the first H1 and one for the second H1. If I go ahead and click one of these, what you can see is that both of these H1s are now visible. And that's because they're using the same piece of state, the same isVisible piece of state. So if I go ahead and click the second one, now they both disappear. But the thing is, for our example, we want to actually make each one of these independent of each other. So when I click one show hide button, we should only be toggling the visibility of one of the H1s, not both of them. So let's flip back to VS Code and see how we would do that. So what we can do is we can copy this line, and let's just make this isVisible to, and toggle isVisible to. And then down here we'll change isVisible to isVisible to, toggle is visible to toggle is visible to, and we'll flip is visible to back and forth. All right, so let's flip back to the browser now. And if we click one of the buttons, we can see that only one of the H1s is now visible. And let's click the other one. Now both are visible. Right, so now they're independent of each other. So we've achieved what we wanted to achieve, but what's the problem here? Well, the major problem is that we're not keeping our code dry.
Oh, word?
We're repeating ourselves. You can see from these two lines that we're basically setting up a piece of state, which is a Boolean value. And then in these onClick handlers here, we're duplicating the same functionality. We're creating a function that flips a Boolean value back and forth. So this is where the custom hook is going to come in to be super valuable. So in order to create our custom hook, what we want to do is we want to take this logic here and basically extract it to another function. And in order to create that function, I'm going to go ahead and actually make a new file. And I'm going to call it useToggle.js. Now we don't have to name our custom hooks in this way, but if we check out the React docs, they recommend that we do, mostly because it's the convention to do so. And also they note that if we don't start our custom hooks with the word use, they say we wouldn't be able to automatically check for violations of rules of hooks because we wouldn't be able to tell if a certain function contains calls to hooks inside of it. So anyway, back to writing our custom hook. Let's split the screen in two so we can see both our custom hook here and our app.js here on the left side. So let's start off by writing a function, which we'll call useToggle. And we'll make that an arrow function. And let's go ahead and make sure we export it. Export default useToggle. Because we're going to pull useToggle into our app.js file. So now we're going to talk about how to fill out this useToggle function to create the custom hook. We're actually going to make use of the useState hook inside of our custom hook. So we want to bring that in first. So we'll import useState from React. And our whole goal in writing this function is to create a generic toggle function, one that we can reuse in different places and use amongst many different components. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to call useState here. Let's give it an initial Boolean value. We'll give it false. And then we'll do our array destructuring. And for now, let's call our state property, let's just call it state. And for our setter, we'll just call that setState. Now here's kind of the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. What we're going to do is we're going to create a function within this function. I'm just going to call it flipState. We'll make it an arrow function. And it's this function that's going to make use of our setter, setState. So when this function is called eventually, it's going to run setState, which is going to do the work of flipping our state or our Boolean value from true to false, false to true, and so on. And now what we can do is we'll be able to return an array from this function containing the state and that flip state function. I think this is all going to make a lot more sense to you once you see how we bring it into app.js and actually use it. So then, how to actually use our custom hook? Well, we've already imported useToggle, so that's cool. What we're going to do is, instead of calling useState, we're going to use useToggle in place of that. So we'll put useToggle here and useToggle here. We can get rid of useState at this point because we're not using it in this file. We're actually using it in our custom hook file here. And here's the nice thing. For each of these buttons, we no longer have to create this functionality and duplicate it like we did before. Instead, for the first one, we're just going to call toggle is visible from here. And for the second one, we're going to call toggle is visible to from here. So now the actual functionality is occurring here in our custom hook. Let's flip back to the browser and make sure it all works. So here we are, show hide, our two buttons. And these are both independent of each other. The other thing I'll say is that we actually don't need to pass in false here because we've passed in false as the initial value of our state here. What we can do is actually give our custom hook a parameter, let's call it default state, and have that default to be the value false. And then we can just pass in that default state here So in this way, if you call useToggle and you don't pass in an argument, it'll default to false. But you can come in here and override that. You can maybe pass in true for this one. If you want to be explicit about it, you can come in here and pass in false for the second one if you wanted this one to initialize to false, or you can just leave it out. So you can see that now that we've extracted the logic for toggling into this custom hook, we can import it into any component that we want. And for something as common as toggling a Boolean value, we don't need to keep replicating that logic and duplicating our code. So thanks for checking out this video. If you feel like you got something out of it, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel so I can bring you more. See you next time.